The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Mary Grady, and I'm going to walk you through some background on the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO's Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, also called the CORSIA, and ACR's role. First, I want to quickly review webinar logistics. Everyone will be on mute. However, you can submit questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the chat box near the bottom of your webinar pane. If we don't answer your questions after the presentation today, we'll send responses by email. Also, please note that this webinar is intended to focus on ICAO's offset program and will not cover other aspects of the CORSIA, such as airline MRV. You can find answers to questions on the other technical aspects of the CORSIA on ICAO's website, including in an extensive FAQ document. So who is the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO? ICAO is a UN agency established under the 1944 Convention on Civil International Aviation, or the Chicago Convention, and it has 192 member states. ICAO creates regulations for aviation safety, security, efficiency, and regularity and environmental protection. The organization also regulates operating practices and procedures covering the technical field of aviation. So international aviation is important because in 2018, domestic and international flights emitted around 895 million tons of CO2, which is 2.4% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. If aviation were a country, it would be the 6th largest country in the world between Japan and Germany. Aviation emissions have increased 26% by 2013 alone and are expected to continue to grow, with passenger numbers projected to double to 8.2 billion in 2037. Emissions from flights between countries were not covered under the UNFCCC Kyoto Protocol and are not included in the Paris Agreement emission reporting, which only covers domestic aviation and not flights between countries. So ICAO members wanted to avoid a patchwork of regulation and carbon taxes imposed by different countries for international flights, and this is why they created the CORSIA. In 2010, at the 37th ICAO Assembly, they agreed to an aspirational goal of carbon neutral growth for international aviation from 2020. In 2013, at the 38th ICAO Assembly, they reaffirmed carbon neutral growth from 2020 and agreed to develop a global market-based mechanism to achieve it. And in 2016, at the 39th ICAO Assembly, the 192 member countries of ICAO passed Resolution A393. The global market-based mechanism would be fulfilled with the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA. To achieve carbon neutral growth from 2020, ICAO members will implement a basket of measures to reduce emissions, including operational efficiency and technology improvements, sustainable alternative fuels, and market-based measures under the CORSIA, and that's where the offsetting falls. Next. 2019 and 2020 is the time frame to develop the MRV and the emissions baseline. In 2021 to 2023, this is phase 1, or the pilot phase, where countries voluntarily opt in. As of February 27th this year, 82 states representing 76.64% of international aviation activity have opted in. Units for the CORSIA compliance in this first phase are to be canceled by 2024. In 2024 to 2026, this is phase 2. It's the first implementation phase, but also on a voluntary opt-in basis. 2027 to 2035 is phase 3, the second implementation phase, which will include most states. There's mandatory compliance during this phase unless exempted. ICAO will undergo a review every 3 years, starting in 2022, and a special review in 2032 will assess whether to extend the global market-based mechanism past 2035. ICAO estimates the offset demand through 2035 to be between 2.5 billion and 3.5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. Next. The process ICAO determined to evaluate programs for eligibility to supply emission reduction units for the CORSIA compliance was through a technical advisory body, or TAB. The TAB was created in 2019 to evaluate programs against ICAO's published emissions unit criteria, which is detailed in the upcoming slides. The TAB consists of members from 19 countries, including Brazil, Canada, China, Colombia, France, India, Kenya, Mexico, Nigeria, Norway, Qatar, South Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Sweden, UAE, United States, and Zambia. To be designated as a CORSIA eligible program and CORSIA eligible units, programs must demonstrate that they meet the ICAO emissions unit criteria, which include 10 program design elements and 8 carbon offset credit integrity criteria. So this is a list. I'm going to actually read to you how these different design elements are defined by ICAO. So the first is clear methodologies and protocols and their development process. Programs should have qualification and quantification methodologies in place and available for use, as well as a process for developing further methodologies. The existing methodologies, as well as the process for developing additional methodologies, to be publicly disclosed. Scope considerations. Programs should define and publicly disclose the level at which activities are allowed under the program, as well as the eligibility criteria for each type of offset activity, such as which sectors, project types, or geographic locations are covered. For offset credit issuance and retirement procedures, programs should have in place procedures for how offset credits are issued, retired, canceled, subject to discounting, and the length of the crediting period and whether that period is renewable. For identification and tracking, programs should have in place procedures that ensure that units are tracked, that units are individually identified through serial numbers, the registry has robust security provisions in place, that units have clearly identified owners or holders. The program should also stipulate to which, if any, other registries it's linked, and whether and which international data exchange standards the registry conforms with. For the legal nature and transfer of units, the program should define and ensure that the underlying attributes and the property aspects of a unit. For validation and verification procedures, programs should have in place publicly disclosed validation and verification standards and procedures, as well as requirements and procedures for the accreditation of validators and verifiers. For program governance, programs should publicly disclose who is responsible for the administration of the program, how decisions are made. The program should demonstrate it has been continuously governed and operational for at least the last 2 years, that it has in place a plan for the long-term administration of multi-decadal program elements, which includes possible responses to the dissolution of the program in its current form. For transparency and public participation, programs should publicly disclose what information is captured and made available to different stakeholders, what its stakeholder consultation requirements are, what its public comment provisions and requirements are, and it must conduct a public comment periods and transparently disclose all approved quantification methodologies. For safeguard systems, programs should have in place safeguards to address environmental and social risks. For sustainable development criteria, programs should disclose sustainable development criteria and requirements for reporting on contributions to sustainable development. And for avoidance of double counting, issuance, and claiming, programs should provide information on how they address double counting, issuance, and claiming in the context of involving national and international regimes for carbon markets and emissions trading. The carbon offset integrity assessment criteria include a list that is pretty familiar with those of us in the carbon market. And there are definitions for all of these as well. They must be additional, be based on a realistic and credible baseline, be quantified, monitored, and reported and verified. In this case, the ex post verification of the project emission reductions are required in advance, and no ex-ante crediting is allowed. A clear and transparent chain of custody, permanent emission reductions so that they represent emission reductions that are permanent, and if there's a risk of reversal, then either the credits are not eligible or mitigation measures are in place to monitor, mitigate, and compensate for reversals. Leakage assessment and mitigation, no double counting towards a mitigation obligation, and no net harm. I would just, on the double counting, this is important because there are a number of ways which units could be double counted. So double issuance occurs if more than one unit is issued for the same emission reduction. Double use occurs when the same unit is issued twice. So for example, if it's duplicated in a registry. And double claiming occurs if the same emission reduction is counted twice by both the buyer and the seller. On June 14th last year, ICAO opened a window for programs to apply for assessment by the TAB against the CORSIA emissions unit criteria. Applications were due by July 12th, 2019, so we had 30 days to respond. ACR was one of 14 programs to submit an application, and all of those applications are published on the ICAO website. In August and September last year, ACR responded to several rounds of written questions and answers from the TAB, and we interviewed with the TAB in Montreal in October. In January of this year, the TAB submitted its recommendations to ICAO on eligible programs and units. The TAB recommendations from its assessment are also available on the ICAO website. And on last Friday, March 13th, the ICAO Council adopted the TAB recommendations and approved 6 programs. The approved programs and units, including any limitations and exclusions, will be published on the ICAO website in a document called CORSIA Eligible Emissions Units. ACR's application to ICAO included all approved and active methodologies in all sectors with no exclusions. ICAO approved all sectors submitted by ACR and all AT methodologies in the agriculture, forestry, and land use, livestock, transport, fugitive emissions, waste handling, geologic sequestration, and energy sectors. And this slide presents a list of all of the eligible methodologies. In addition to eligible units from approved programs and sectors, ICAO has imposed eligibility parameters on associated time frame for units. This unit date eligibility applies to all CORSIA eligible emissions units approved for use in the pilot phase. For now, units are only eligible for cancellation for use towards CORSIA offsetting requirements in the 2021 to 2023 compliance cycle. Eligible units are those that were issued to activities that started their first crediting period from January 1st, 2016 for emission reductions that occur through December 31st, 2020. So you may be asking yourself why the limitation on eligible units only through 2020. This decision, as we understand, is based on having rules and mechanisms in place to avoid double counting. Next slide. So as described earlier, the emissions unit criteria require that programs have measures in place to ensure that units are only counted once towards a mitigation obligation and avoid double issuance, double use, and double claiming. In the case of the Paris Agreement, double claiming is when the same emission reduction is counted towards the climate change mitigation effort of both an airline and the host country where the emissions reduction activity occurred. Starting in 2021, ICAO requires host country authorization and attestation to properly account for units used for CORSIA by reporting a corresponding adjustment to the UNFCCC so as not to double claim with NDC achievement. The ACR standard version 6, chapter 10, already includes this requirement under 10B1, which states that ACR will require notification by the owner of the emission reductions of the export of any emission reductions for these purposes, as well as a formal host country letter of assurance and authorization of the use of emission reductions by another party, including for the CORSIA. A host country letter of assurance and authorization will be required before ACR would designate post-2020 units as eligible and qualified for CORSIA. The emissions unit criteria also requires that programs have an approved compensation mechanism for double claims, which currently no program has in place. The ICAO states the programs should have procedures in place for the program to compensate for, replace, or otherwise reconcile the double claim mitigation associated with units used under the CORSIA, which the host country's national accounting focal point or designee otherwise attested its intention to not double claim. So this means that if the host country agrees to make a corresponding adjustment but does not do so, the program must have a mechanism to compensate for the emission reduction claim by both the host country towards its NDC achievement and an airline towards its CORSIA obligation. Programs will have to have a double claiming compensation mechanism in place and approved by ICAO in order to be eligible to supply units post-2020. ACR's next program update will address this and put in place a mechanism to compensate for double claims. Once the update is made and approved by ICAO, we expect post-2020 units will be deemed eligible for CORSIA. So there are a few other requirements. All units used to compensate for reversals must also be CORSIA eligible. No ex-ante units are allowed. All CORSIA eligible units must be clearly designated as such on the registry. And the cancellation of units for use by airlines towards their CORSIA obligation must clearly indicate the airline and the compliance period for which the units are being canceled. So in order to meet these ICAO requirements to clearly designate which units are CORSIA eligible, ACR has already made functionality updates to its registry. These updates are not yet live since we were waiting for ICAO approval, but they will be live by early April, if not sooner. On the emissions data entry tab, we will have 3 questions to track CORSIA targeted issuances. Next page. In addition, all units that are CORSIA eligible will be tagged in the registry public reports as qualified. And in order to meet ICAO requirements that cancellation of units for use by airlines towards their CORSIA obligation must clearly indicate the airline and the compliance period, we have added a new cancellation reason of CORSIA compliance to the cancellation drop-down menu and a field to enter the name of the airline. The compliance period can be entered in the notes section. Lastly, ACR will track credit details for annual reporting requirements to ICAO. So going forward, all ICAO-approved programs are responsible to notify the ICAO Secretariat of any material program change, which is defined as any updates to a program's scope of eligibility that would alter the program's response to any questions in the application form and further inquiries from the tab over the course of the program's assessment. The tab will then determine whether such changes require further review and approval by ICAO. So with regards to the process to have eligible units that have already been issued, tagged as eligible, CORSIA eligible units, what we need you to do is send an email to acr@winrock.org with ICAO eligible units in the subject line, include the name of the project and the project ID, confirm the start date of the first crediting period for activities after January 1st, 2016, indicate the volume and serial numbers that are to be tagged as ICAO eligible on the registry, and confirm the name of the account in which the credits are being held. So there's lots of good information on the CORSIA on the ICAO website. You can read the emissions unit criteria, including definitions and guidelines on interpretation. You can review all 14 program applications to ICAO. You can see the list of the 19 members of the tab. You can read the 2020 tab recommendation to ICAO on eligible programs and units. and you can read details for the CORSIA eligible emissions units, which is a document that ICAO still has to publish. I think that's it. So we'll, I think Jessica Orrego is going to help me with some questions. Jessica, if you want to start.
Sure. Thanks, Mary, and hello, everybody. Okay, so a few questions have come in. Here's a question. The question is, if a project has been issued credits that have 2016 through 2019 vintages, but has a crediting period start date before January 1st, 2016, are those credits eligible under CORSIA? So the answer is no. Only activities that started after January 1st, 2016 are eligible for CORSIA. So the eligibility is not based on vintage. The 2016 date ties back to the year that the CORSIA resolution was passed by ICAO. So it is a start date requirement and not a vintage requirement. Okay, I'm just gonna look.
So maybe I'll take the next one.
Okay, go ahead.
You're looking. So is there a process for ACR methodologies that were not part of the initial application process that are subsequently approved by ACR to be approved by ICAO? So our understanding of this is that it would depend on whether it would be considered material and whether that would be considered as something that would have changed our program response. So if it's within the sectoral programs that were approved, the tab may determine that that does not need further review. If for example, if a new methodology is in a sector that's already approved and goes through the same methodology approval process that we disclosed in our application, which is the public comment and a scientific peer review, then it's likely that that will not require further approval. But I think it's also going to depend on the methodology itself. And I think we would probably err on the side of caution and submit any program updates that we have to the tab, and then they would determine whether they think it's material or not.
Okay. I can take the next one. A question came in, can airlines already start purchasing CORSIA eligible emission units now? So the answer is yes. Airlines can start purchasing emission units at any time. However, currently eligible emission units are only for the purpose of meeting offsetting requirements under the pilot phase of CORSIA. As Mary mentioned, the pilot phase is going to be between 2021 and 2023.
Great. There's a couple easy ones maybe. So is the ACR application public record? Yes, it's all of the 14 applications to ICAO are published on the ICAO website, and you can read all of those. And then there's a question about do we have any guidance for project developers who now need to get a host country letter of approval? So at this stage, there is no host country letter of approval required for units through 2020, through December 31st, 2020, because the reporting under the Paris Agreement begins after that. For project developers who want to get a host country letter of approval for units post 2020, yes, we do have guidance and we can send that to you. So just send the email to acr@winrock.org.
Okay, I can take the next one. The question is, can an airline implement a project that generates the CORSIA eligible emission units? So yes, an airline can implement projects that generate emission units, but just like any other emission unit, the emission units generated from whatever project that an airline implements would need to meet the same CORSIA emissions unit criteria if the airline wishes to use those units to fulfill its offsetting requirements under CORSIA. So all of the emissions units used for compliance under CORSIA have to meet the same eligibility criteria.
Okay, so here's one. Are any RED projects registration possible under ACR in the future? ACR does not include international forestry outside of North America in its scope. Winrock does serve as the secretariat for another initiative called the Architecture for RED Plus Transactions, or ART. ART was recently launched, and it is a program for crediting national and jurisdictional scale RED Plus. And we intend to submit an application to ICAO for ART in the next round. But RED project registration will not be possible on ACR in the future, no.
Okay. Another question is, can an airline cancel CORSIA emission units prior to having received its total final offsetting requirements at the end of a given compliance cycle? And the answer to that is yes. An airline can purchase and cancel the eligible emission units or credits at any time, and it does not need to wait until the end of that compliance period to cancel them. So it can cancel them before being notified of its total final offsetting requirements.
So here's another one. Is there any possibility that the present CCS methodology be extended to outside the US with some baseline and additionality modifications? So the answer to that is probably yes, but we obviously, the devil's in the detail, so we would need to talk with you about what that would entail. So feel free to reach out to us directly on that.
Okay. There's a question about what the price is for purchasing CORSIA credits. So that's not currently known. The purchase price will be determined, between the offset buyer and the seller, and is likely to depend on many factors, such as the balance of supply and demand for the credits, the eligible credits in the market. ICAO did prepare estimates, but they are ranging between $6 a ton on the low side and $40 a ton on the high side. So that's quite a broad range. So it's still not known.
So here's one about supply. Given the 2016 vintage date, do you know how many offsets are already in the system available for the first reporting period? So first, to clarify, there is no vintage eligibility date. So the eligibility date of 2016 is based on the project's first reporting period. So any project that started its first reporting period after January 1st, 2016, that's what the eligibility criteria is. It's not based on vintage. So with regard to how many offsets are already in the system available for that, we don't really have an answer for that. Obviously we know what's been issued, but companies enter into sales contracts all the time for forward sales. We're not privy to those agreements. So with the exception of what's been issued and looking at what's been canceled, we don't know. And there are also new projects being registered with us on a regular basis that may be eligible as well.
Okay, there's a question about what other units are CORSIA eligible other than ACR units. So the ICAO Council approved ACR and as well as 5 other programs to be eligible to supply emissions units for CORSIA. So you can look at the ICAO website for details on the other programs and units that were approved, and the website details the exclusions and the limitations for each program if there were any. And then, as Mary mentioned, information will also be made available in the ICAO document that is called CORSIA Eligible Emissions Units, but that's not yet published.
Okay, I think the only other groups of questions I'm seeing are about sending out the slides. So we will be sending the slides out, and they will also be posted on the ACR website, along with a recording to this webinar for those who weren't able to attend or would like to listen in again. I think that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate your spending time with us today.
Thanks a lot.